Mary Beth O'Connor is a retired judge who started shooting meth at 16 years old.
My mother wasn't really connected to me. She was violent. For me, things just got much, much worse at 9 because she married my stepfather. And he was very violent with her, and he was physically, sexually violent with me.
The chaos in her early life carried on into college.
I had a really violent, life-threatening rape, and I moved in with a violent boyfriend, and it was sort of like the little bit of grip that I had, I lost.
These experiences drove her deeper and deeper into addiction.
You know, I was using meth really almost daily for 10 years.
She came to a place where she couldn't hold down a job, her partner left her, and she entered rehab. That's where she learned about the utter lack of resources available.
And in my mind, you know, it's medical treatment. They told me repeatedly, this is all there is. 12 steps are nothing, and 12 steps just wasn't a great fit for me.
So she found her own path. She got a PhD, and she became a judge.
And so I really wanted to loudly own that I shot meth because I recovered, and to sort of use it as that reassurance that those people deserve our help too. There is definitely the possibility of recovery if they're given what they need to get there.
In this episode, Donna and I talked to Mary Beth about her own personal journey away from crystal meth addiction, how she maintained her recovery as an atheist, and how she's using her experiences as a person in recovery and now retired judge to educate law professionals. We even talked about safe supply and decriminalization, but before we get into it, what's up? My name's Dan, podcaster, keynote speaker, and advocate, and this is Hard Knocks Talks, your addictions podcast. If you hear something you like or dislike, don't forget to leave us a comment and let us know your thoughts. And with that, let's get into our conversation with Mary Beth O'Connor.
This is Hard Knocks Talks.
Hey, Mary Beth, how are you?
Good. Thanks for having me.
Of course. I came across you a little while ago on LinkedIn, and like, you know, your banner art says from junkie to judge, and that definitely piqued my interest. I do have some friends that are lawyers that were, you know, one was disbarred and the other one, I think they were both disbarred, and they had their journeys through that. But I mean, you did not come into the legal profession until after you got sober. Is that correct?
That's the short version, is that I went to law school when I had 6.5 years sober. And so, yes, but the longer version is that I actually was accepted to Berkeley Law right out of college. And I did go for a little bit, but I had started using meth again on a really serious basis 6 months before. And so I couldn't do it. I gave back a top 10 law school because of my addiction. And 16 years later, 6.5 years sober, I actually went for real.
Yeah.
Wow. Amazing.
So why don't you take us back then, before we get into where we're at currently here? Why don't you tell us how this all got started from you? Because I mean, that's quite a remarkable journey. I mean, you've suffered some traumatic events and some pretty heavy drug use, actually pretty early on in your life. So why don't you tell us how this all got started?
Yeah, I mean, you know, my mother wasn't really connected to me. That was a problem. She was violent, she was violent. But for me, things just got much, much worse at 9 because she married my stepfather. And he was very violent with her, and he was physically, sexually violent with me. And so it was just a very high stress environment where I never knew what was going to happen, where what I did and what happened to me had very little relationship. And so when I found my first drug, which was when I was 12, and it was alcohol, it was Boone's Farm Strawberry Hill wine, which I know a lot of people are familiar with. And so that was the beginning. And what I noticed with the alcohol right away was that it made me feel better. I mean, it made me feel more relaxed. I wasn't as anxious. I was sort of laughing in a more honestly joyful way. And so that really caught my attention, and I pursued alcohol right away. Quickly moved on, weed, pills, a lot of acid my sophomore year of high school. And at 16, I found my drug of choice, which was methamphetamine. And I was shooting meth by 17 and in full bore addiction when I graduated high school. So it was a really early start and a fast escalation.
So tell me, like, what was that like did you know that you were going down a dark path, or did this all just feel like you're living life in the fast lane and that everything was peachy?
You know, I definitely there were a lot of incidents even before the meth where things happened, like I crashed my car, and other people were telling me that I needed to slow down. Like the other druggies were telling me I was doing too much, but meth definitely escalated the process, very quickly. I mean, that's when I started staying up for days and started really looking bad. I, lost weight, and I was picking at my skin, and I was gray, and I was more in a sort of a very negative cycle. And so that's when the negative impact was much, much worse than it had been before.
Hmm. What were your aspirations when you were growing up? Did you ever foresee yourself moving into law?
Yeah, I mean, school had always been the one positive experience in my life. Even as a child, I always did well. I always got a lot of positive attention at school. And so that was my special place where I was seen, where I was sort of valued for some skills and sort of natural traits that I had. And so I was brought up in a very blue collar environment. No one in my family had gone to college, but I was always brought up to believe that I would go to college, and that was my intention. And my senior year, when I started really doing a lot of meth, I had already really applied to colleges, right? I mean, they don't see your second half of your senior year grades really, they see earlier. And so I was already accepted. I came from Central Jersey to California. I graduated from Berkeley. So I
Mm.
always had planned on going to college, and I always had intended to go to law school. That was my goal.
Mm. So, you mentioned just a few moments ago that when you did get into university, like you started using meth again. Now, does am I to believe that there was some points in your journey where you had found recovery, that you were abstinent, that life had returned to some form of normalcy?
No, what I did in college was I did better, and better and good are two different words, but it was better. When I came to college, I mostly used alcohol. Sometimes I would use cocaine, which was new to me. Sometimes pills, hallucinogens. Mostly on the weekend. Sometimes it rolled into the week, but it was definitely a significant improvement.
Mm.
But I had a really violent, life threatening rape by three men that lasted 6 hours. And I moved in with a violent boyfriend. And it was sort of like the little bit of grip that I had, I lost. And
Mm.
so in the middle of January of my senior year of college, I started using meth again on a regular basis. And I used until I was 32. So it
Mm.
wasn't that I was absent, but it was just there was a 3.5 year period where I did somewhat better, still more than my peers, still more than the people around me. But for me, it was an improvement.
So, now you mentioned that you grew up around a lot of domestic violence, and
Yes.
you what you just mentioned now, you moved in with a violent boyfriend. You had a very violent experience. Do you think that there's a connection between growing up around that and then finding yourself involved in it later on?
I mean, the data does show that if you have a trauma history like that, your odds of having future traumas is higher than normal. And it's really interesting. I mean, let's take the violent boyfriend.
Hmm.
I knew that he was violent before I moved in with him. So it wasn't like it was a surprise, but he was a sort of a charismatic guy, but he was also damaged from child abuse. He had a violent parents. And so there was sort of a recognition of, we understood each other. We know each other's pain. He's, sort of like me. There's a trauma bond.
I was just
And
gonna
so
say.
I felt
Mhm.
connected to him, and yet he was violent with me. Although compared to my stepfather, it was less, right? So it's like this weird inability to sort of judge what's normal or acceptable.
Hmm.
But it was just also that sort of high intensity emotional situation was what I grew up with, and it felt sort of normal to me. And so it didn't deter me in the way that it might have deterred others. And so I did walk into it knowing he was violent, although the violence got worse when we lived together.
Hmm. So, at what point did it end then? I mean, it sounds like was it the violent occurrences that sort of snapped you into some form of reality, or did that just send you deeper? Like, tell us a bit more about how you got out.
Yeah, so I did actually leave that violent boyfriend at some point, and I mean I was only with him like 2.5 years, I think, and so I left him. I had a better boyfriend, a calmer boyfriend, and that was a help. But after once I left college and once I withdrew from law school that first time, for the next 10 years, I was using meth really almost daily for 10 years, and so it was a really volatile life. As far as, let's say, work, my terminology is I had worked my way down the corporate ladder because I
Mm.
couldn't hold a job, because I couldn't get there. And if I was there, I couldn't focus. And so I had a Berkeley degree and good grades. And every job I had was less money and less responsibility, and I held it for less time. So by the time I was 32, my last job was word processing. And I could only hold it for 9 months. That's where I was.
Mm.
But also by 32, 10 years later from college, I was having physical problems. I mean, meth is a highly toxic drug, and it was showing. I was really emotionally destroyed. I was feeling hopeless. I was feeling trapped. I didn't see a way out, and I was just in misery. And then my partner, who I was living with, the better boyfriend, but he was better, but he wasn't. He was only going to put up with so much, and he was done. He
Mm.
was done, and he was going to throw me out. And so it was sort of like all those things together that made me finally say, well, maybe I ought to go to rehab.
Yeah,
Maybe
yeah.
that would be a good
So so you said that you worked your way down the ladder, so to speak. When you came out of university, what was your first roles? Like, did you gain some status in the corporate world, or what did that look like to you? And
It was definitely what I was doing. Basically, was sort of administrative management and supervision. At an entry level, and then somewhat at a mid level. But that's what it was. I mean, I was a history major in college, so I didn't have that was my degree. I had a liberal arts degree, and so
mm,
I'd work. I lived in the Bay Area, and I was living in Silicon Valley then, so I would be at different size high tech companies doing different types of office management or administrative work of some kind or another. And that's
mm,
that's the kind of work I did, which eventually I ended up just doing word processing. So at
yeah.
the time, this is the 90s, I had computer skills, which were not everyone had at that time. And I was a really fast typist. And my Berkeley degree fooled people for a while, right? They're looking at my resume and they're thinking, oh, she must be smart. She's going to be a good employee. And I always had some excuse as to why the prior two jobs, hadn't worked out. And so on paper, I looked better than I was when I showed up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So do you think the fast typing had anything to do with the meth?
Well, I don't know.
The awkward silence.
Fast type this in college, but yeah, yeah. I mean, I still type really quickly,
Yeah.
but the meth. I mean, you know how I don't know. Maybe you don't, but with meth, sure, there's the up and the short run, right? But when you do it on a regular basis, you're not at that sort of optimal point for much of the time. It's
Mhm.
either that I'm trying to get myself to where I'm going to be sort of levelish, or I'm starting to crash, and then I'm trying to push myself up to be semi-functional. And so there's only like 5 minutes, let's say,
Mhm.
where I'm at that really sort of good point as far as work goes. And
Yeah.
so I would miss a lot of days. I wouldn't show up. I would leave early. I would come late. I was just completely unreliable, and so I
Mm.
could only hold on to jobs for relatively brief periods of time.
Yeah, yeah.
Mhm.
And then when you weren't at work, I mean, were you living the lifestyle, or were you hiding at home?
Mostly hiding at home. So, I mean, I had some, drug using friends, but I did spend a lot of time in my dining room table, doing crosswords, playing solitaire, clipping things out of the newspaper that people didn't really need and putting them in envelopes and mailing them off, and all the sort of tweaky behaviors that a lot of people on meth tend to do.
Yeah.
I wasn't really like going out. If you invited me to your party, there was like a 25% chance I'd show up, because
Yeah.
I wouldn't have to be at that sort of right point in my meth cycle, and that was just not a frequent event, or it didn't last long enough.
Mm.
So I was isolating a lot. I was very isolated.
So tell me then, when you went into rehab, when you finally hit your rock bottom. Now it sounds to me like relationships are a big part of your healing journey. Because you mentioned that you had abusive relationships, and the one that was less abusive, he had enough, and that around that thought pattern was when you decided to go into rehab. Is that accurate?
I mean, so his being done was a part of it. I mean, first of all, we had been together for like 8 years or 9 years at that point, so it was a long-term relationship. And he was a good guy, but he just couldn't handle it anymore. It was too volatile for him. I was too unreliable. I wasn't pulling my weight. Basically, I wasn't pulling my weight financially, emotionally. I wasn't able to listen to him or to take his needs into account. So I was a terrible partner.
Mm-hmm.
So he was really done, and that was one of the factors. But it was also that I was so exhausted, I couldn't even put a resume together again. Like, I mean, I just felt like I was just completely depleted. And so going to rehab and sort of having a rest in a way, like a break from the real world, actually had some appeal.
So what was it like then? You went into rehab. Did you still have some of that look at my Berkeley degree type attitude, or were you squashed? Were you done?
I was squashed. I mean, I could barely remember, how that I had done well in school. It was a distant memory at that point. I didn't feel connected to that part of myself at all. It was sort of like a vague in the back of my mind, maybe. I never thought about it, except the loss, right? Like, except if I had to drive past the law school that I gave back because of my addiction, that was painful. But otherwise, I wasn't connected to that at all. It was too long ago, and I couldn't bear the pain of it.
Mm-hmm.
So I was pretty disconnected from all the positive attributes that I had at one point. I was just in a very miserable cycle, and also in a very small box. It's like you're in a tight, small box of misery, and that's what it felt like.
Yeah, yeah. So tell me then, what was it like going into rehab? When you went in there, was it what you thought it would be? Like, or did you have some revelations, and like, was it one and done for you? Because some people go back lots of times.
Yeah, so this is 93, and so I went into a longer term women's program. It was 90-day minimum commitment because 30 days didn't sound right to me. And also I actually had trouble finding a place because I didn't have insurance and I didn't have money. So it took me a while, to find a place that would accept me, that I could actually afford to go to.
Mm-hmm.
And in my mind, it's medical treatment, right? I'm going to go get medical treatment. And when I got to my rehab, I found out very quickly that they were a 12-step, exclusively, adamantly, vehemently, there is nothing else. That they told me repeatedly, this is all there is. 12 steps are nothing.
Mm-hmm.
And 12 steps just wasn't a great fit for me. So I don't believe in a higher power. I wasn't going to turn over my will in my life. I didn't like the powerless idea, the focus on defects. But they kept telling me that there was literally nothing else. They told me, do this or you will fail. Do it or you will fail. And that was a real shock. I didn't expect that. And I wasn't sure what to do about it. Because on one hand, I know that's not going to work for me. On the other hand, I know my thinking is foggy. And so it's sort of hard to trust my own judgment. And so it was a real dilemma. But what I decided to do, since they said that's all there is just sort of look for the parts I could use and ignore everything else, So,
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I participated in rehab. I did everything I was supposed to do. And I read all the AA big book, and I read all the NA text, and I try to find sort of like what's underneath the step. Is there a core idea here that I can use, even if I don't apply it the way they're telling me I have to apply it? So that's how I tried to tackle it. Like the powerless step, which I didn't agree with. What I thought about it, and I decided what I could agree is that I am powerless to moderate. Like there's no moderating, I tried to sort of frame it in ways that would be comfortable for me. But it was still really terrifying because they told me I was going to fail. And so I was really worried that there was no option for me to stay sober. But when I got home, I decided to do some research and see if it was true that there were no other options. And that was sort of the next step for me.
Yeah. So I'm interested to know what you pulled, the core values that you pulled out of the program. I think that's really interesting, that being sort of pigeonholed into that modality, and making the best of it. And I mean, some of it must have stuck. You must have found some things that brought value to your life. Tell us a little bit about that before we go moving on.
Yeah, I mean, like I found the one day at a time idea really helpful. In the beginning, like if I was struggling with cravings, I would just say, I'm not deciding for tomorrow, right? I'm just going to not use today. I found when I looked at the step 3, turn your will and your life over to the God of your understanding. I wasn't going to do that, but I thought about it and I thought, what? I think what I can use it for is this idea of limited control. That like I should do the legwork for things, but I couldn't always control the outcome. So that's sort of how I reframed that one. And then there were a lot of other things like recommending group support and building sober relationships and, that people, places, and things that 12 Steps talks a lot about. Seems like that was useful. And so I was just trying to always filter it for, is there some core here that I can use? But and also rehab, right? They made me do, a lot of journaling, and I had a little bit of therapy and a little bit of education about what addiction is, and those were helpful things. Did a little bit of trauma work on my sexual assaults and my child abuse. So there were parts of it that I could use. And I also bonded with some of the women. So I was developing relationships two of which I still have. I still have lunch several times a year with two of my rehab roommates from 1993. So there were things that I was able to pull out of it that were helpful.
Let's look at Barb's comment.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for your comment, Barb. Question. Barb would like to know, do you think women in particular struggle with the powerlessness aspect of the 12 steps approach?
I will say this. So when I got home, I looked for the other options, and they turned out, and I will say for the younger people, there's no Google, okay? Like it's 1994 now. So I got my car and I drove to the library. And the first option I found was Women for Sobriety, which still exists today. And the founder of Women for Sobriety founded it because she felt that the idea of the ego busting approach of 12 steps wasn't really right for a lot of women, because a lot of women have already been so beaten down that what they need is to be built up. And
I'm going to interrupt you. And I apologize for interrupting you there, but Donna, you said that exact thing. I remember, because like I was a very staunch program guy early on, and I still go to the odd meeting, and I still, I'm real good at, I can almost be the big book lawyer guy if I wanted to be, but so in fact, I found a second edition big book in my mom's basement the other day, and I kind of had a bit of a moment over it. But all that aside, when I got sober, I was a program guy. Donna, she got sober 16 months later, something like that. And I very much tried my best to shame her and guilt her and overpower her and all of the things, and get her into the program. And she said that same thing. She's like, I've been beat down enough. I don't need to have my ass kicked around those rooms too. And that wouldn't land for me. I just couldn't have it. So it's interesting that you framed that the way that you did. So there you go. There's like an entire program built for that whole thing. Sorry again. Yeah.
That's right. And you would be interested in a Women for Sobriety meeting. The introduction, the identifier isn't "I'm Mary Beth and I'm an addict." It's "I'm Mary Beth and I'm a competent woman." That's that's how you identify. And so it's just a very different approach. Does that sound something like you wish you would have found out about in your early recovery?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That would have been really, really beneficial in my early recovery. So I ended up basically going it alone in some regards. Like I did have, community-based organizations supporting me. But in terms of like a program or anything like that, I literally was just muddling around and trying to just kind of figure it out. And even with the supports that I did have, a lot of them were 12 steppers. And so there was a lot of the, those concepts and principles that were kind of being brought up to me. And there was just that's just not landing right for me, and in actuality, many of the same things that you mentioned that you had struggles with were mine as well. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it sounds like you ultimately did the same thing I did, which was build a plan that worked for you, because I didn't end up actually following just Women for Sobriety. I read their books and I went to meetings, but I also found Rational Recovery, which today mostly is Smart Recovery. And I found secular organization for sobriety, which exists very little, but basically today is Lifeline Secular Recovery. And I just continued to do the same thing I did with 12 steps, which was I read everything and I attended meetings and I synthesized it. I was always filtering it for, is this an idea that I think will be useful to me? Is this a technique or a strategy? Like even during the smoke breaks at 12-step meetings, I was listening. Like, is somebody saying something useful that
Nope.
they approach their debt reduction this way, or they're trying this new idea? It was like I was proactively looking for ideas. And it sounds like you did that too. You ended up, reaching and filtering things for what you thought would be helpful. And that today, Lifeline calls that a personal recovery plan. And that's what I did. And I just had 30 years of sobriety in January. So I think I built a pretty
Congratulations.
solid foundation.
Yeah.
I don't think you're going back. No.
I don't think so.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and honestly, there's many times Donna is, between the two of us, she is the more grounded one. Despite all of my staunch 12-step old timer kicking my ass around the room programming, which I'm not bashing. It worked for me. You know, it did what it needed to do. I stayed sober. Would I have stayed sober otherwise? Who's to say? But I still love going to those meetings from time to time. So, were you always an atheist?
No, and let me just say, I support 12 steps too, when it's the right fit. My only complaint is when people say it's the only way or a better way, because neither one of those statements are true. And you're really putting other people's recovery at risk when you sort of misinform them that way, right? I think it's helpful to share what worked for us as like information. I think the newcomer can benefit from us saying, here's what I did, here's what worked for me, here's why I think it worked, for your consideration, right? For information for you to think about, but not a mandate that you need to do it the way I did it. That's where I think we cross the line, and where we go from helpful to overbearing and actually sometimes having a negative impact on people.
Absolutely. And folks that I encountered that had that sort of mentality or approach, I often withdrew from,
Yes.
And it's like I found throughout my life, for whatever weird reason, I end up kind of not fitting in boxes. And so when you present me with this very rigid box, I'm like, that's not going to work. I'm going to fail. I'm not even going to try. So, that kept me using even, because I felt like there was just, I'm not going to succeed. So why bother trying? It wasn't until, I found this sort of other way, that I started to come out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. And the other way, I don't know if there's even a name for it. It's the Donna Anonymous.
I don't know. Well, and I had a baby, so there was not a lot of going to meetings, and I didn't do a lot of reading because I was more worried about the infant, trying to like be there for her and all the things that involves. So it was a lot of like guided meditations and just different things that I found online to change my way of thinking and change my perspective on things. And it was really about mindset for me.
Well, and I will say, so I'm also on the board for She Recovers, which is not just for substance recovery, but also trauma and mental health and behavioral disorders like gambling or eating. It's for recovery from everything, because most women have one or more other things to work on when they get sober. But what She Recovers would call what you did is a patchwork or a hybrid plan. And so it's really about that individual nature. And a lot of people are now mixing and matching, including 12-step people. I mean, there are a lot of 12-step people who start looking into mindfulness or meditation, or who in life, when we get a lot of 12-step people at around year 2, because they're looking for new ideas and new information and new approaches. And so it's much more common today than when I did it. There's still not, like I say, 25% hardcore AA people who refuse to admit that anybody could successfully get sober any other way. But in general, many of the 12-step people are spreading their wings and looking into other options to incorporate, not necessarily to reject their 12 steps, but to incorporate, to add in. Because what works over, in recovery can change over time too. We evolve. Something that we, wasn't on our radar or we didn't need in the early days or didn't have the bandwidth to do 2-3 years later, now it may be something that's going to help us. And so recovery evolves.
Yeah. And it's interesting that you mentioned She Recovers. Sarah Blondin, she was one of the biggest impacts for me. I listened to her creative writings like basically religiously. So
Yeah.
one might say Sarah Blondin was my recovery.
Yeah. I remember Donna's like, you got to listen to this and listen. I'd go over to her house and she'd put it on and just I'd have to sit there and listen and like, and it landed for me even back then. But still, it was like, no, you need more. So yeah, there was no reaching me back then. So I don't even know how else to frame it that's any more kinder to myself. I just, and even to this day, like there's times where I'll sit back and I'll realize something I'd said or something that I did or something that I didn't listen to or something like that. I'm like, man, I'm as unreachable as my 10-year-old boy sometimes. So
Well,
anyways.
but you remember, and you remembered it, and you're thinking about it later, right? I mean, there's a difference. It's what doesn't resonate 2 years ago, we may actually suddenly remember it as something to give a try. So,
That's right.
your ears weren't shut, or you wouldn't have remembered.
Yeah, fair enough. Let's take a quick break here. Let me shout out tonight's sponsors, and we'll get back at it. The Advancing Interprofessional Management of Substance Use Disorders in Saskatchewan program, or AIMS-SK, is offered through the College of Medicine at the University of Saskatchewan and is designed to deepen healthcare professionals' understanding of substance use to improve health outcomes for individuals with substance use disorders. This program consists of 3 modules, including the foundations of harm reduction in substance use disorder, opioid use disorder, and alcohol use disorder. If you are a healthcare professional in Saskatchewan and wish to reduce stigma and better serve those with substance use disorder, look for the AIMS-SK link in the description below. Okay, Pine Lodge, the treatment center I went to 7 years ago when I got sober, offers inpatient addictions treatment and aftercare programming in Regina, Saskatchewan. To inquire about services or to make a donation, call 306-510-1891. Are you affected by someone else's substance use? Family and friends can be okay and do recover. Naranon can help. Contact Ronnie at 306-731-7573 for meeting information. To make contact or learn more about today's sponsors, to check out our new merch, or if you want to show us some love and buy us a coffee, all of those links are also in the show notes below. Mary Beth, why were you using, after what you learned, you found your patchwork modality, whatever worked for you? I would like to know more about any aha moments, like, oh, that clicked, that's, and when the desire to use actually left.
So I will say that I always knew, even when I was using, that my using was trauma related. Like I always knew that it was related to the abuse. And in fact, part of what kept me going was that I didn't see any way to address the abuse. I thought that if I stopped using, I would either, commit suicide or have a, psychotic break or something. So that's what kept me stuck. And so when I got home from rehab, I knew I needed mental health treatment. And so I did seek out a therapist who had trauma expertise. And she, to my surprise, but correctly, diagnosed me with PTSD. And for me, it showed up as really severe anxiety. And so I had to work on that. In fact, that recovery took much longer than my substance recovery because it was more complicated and it came first. And so I was in individual therapy and then a therapy group of women with trauma histories after that. And in total, I was in therapy for like 9 years. And even then, I would say I was 80% recovered. And now I say I'm 92 to 95%, depending on the day. But I don't want to make it scare anybody. It's not like it's 9 years horrible and then light switch. It's, gradually better. But for me, it was that severe anxiety. And I knew I needed to get that under control, not just to have a better chance of staying sober, but just to have my happiest, most productive life. I had to address it. And that was sort of really at the core of everything.
Wow. So you wanted to be a judge? You wanted to, because you had your degree from Berkeley. Now that was not law, right?
No.
So
no,
that's something
history.
Right. That's what you mentioned. So, and you, where did that come from? Where did the desire to be in law, to be a judge, like, where did that come from? Was there a tone of you want to foster change, or what was it? You wanted to educate other law professionals?
So when I was a kid, I was very verbal and very verbally aggressive, and I was very, and I could make a good argument. And so I was always told that I would be a good lawyer, and that was sort of what planted the idea in my head when I was young. And that is what I intended when I went to college. But when I got sober, honestly, my first professional goal was let's not get fired again. Like that was all. I was not thinking about law school or a judge. When I got home from rehab, I had my Berkeley degree and good grades, but I had an embarrassing resume. I mean, it was horrible. And I wasn't really ready for a career job. And so, although I hated it and it was painful to admit, my first job when I got home was a part-time, temporary, low-level administrative job because honestly, it's all I was ready for. Like for me to go to work every day on time and stay all the hours, I wasn't used to doing that. I mean, I just wasn't my pattern, and so I had to sort of build up to it. So I had that really low-level job for 6 months, and then I got a full-time permanent mid-level administrative job, and then I got a job at a bigger company, and I got a promotion, and then I was starting to think about law school. Is there any chance that I could actually go to law school for real? Like for real. But I'm also older. I was 32 when I got sober, so by now I'm in my late 30s. But I was also feeling like I either need to do it or I need to admit I'm never going to do it, like one or the other. And so when I was 39 and 6.5 years sober, that's when I went to law school for real. And then I worked at a big law firm, and then I went to do class action work for the federal government. And then at 20 years sober, I was appointed a federal administrative law judge. So it wasn't that I had that plan from the beginning. It wasn't that I thought I would even necessarily be able to go to law school from the beginning. It was really that step by step. What's the right what am I ready for first job? What's the right next job? How do I get the skills for the next job that I want at a higher level? But I was always really focused on what's next and not thinking, well, maybe when I'm 20 years sober, I'll be a judge. That was not on my mind.
Yeah. Yeah. Donna's always wanted to be a lawyer. And everybody tells her she should be a lawyer. I can see her her crank is turning right now.
Well, it's definitely restoring some hope,
Yeah,
definitely.
Yeah. So what were you, with your experience, like having gone so far down that path with meth addiction and like intravenous use and like, that's the end of the road, man. Like it doesn't get harder than that. Now coming into, back into a professional life in recovery, tell us about some of the stigmatic or thought patterns that you were coming into. Because I mean, now, if you look at your LinkedIn page, you see that you're educating judges, you're educating lawyers on the realities around substance use. So tell us about what some of those experiences were like early on when you first started taking the stage in the professional arena.
Started taking the stage around substance use.
Well, just even like entering the workforce again, and then going to school, and like you saying, working in big law firms and different things like that. Now, certainly you must have heard conversations that you're like, oh my God, I can't believe these people think like this, or else you wouldn't be educating the way that you are today. So tell us about some of those experiences when you came face to face with the stigma that you're trying to provide education for now.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, lawyers, for example, they have like double the substance use disorder rate for every drug. I mean, listed drugs, lawyers, it's double. And part of that's just a lot of the pressure of the work and that there's sort of like no break. And also a lot of people actually don't like being a lawyer and they feel sort of trapped. We call it golden handcuffs in Silicon Valley, where you've got this big house and your kids in private school and you put yourself in a position where it's hard to leave that salary. And so I definitely saw people that were not happy in their work. Some of them were over drinking. There was no one when I was a lawyer that I was sure was doing any kind of other drug besides alcohol. But you could tell that people are unhappy and they're miserable. And so when I started thinking about when I retired as a judge, so I was a judge for 5.5 years, and I always emphasize early retirement. And I started thinking about what my retirement life would look like. Part of what I thought about was, can I use my story for a purpose, right? And so I had already been working on my memoir, from Junkie to Judge. But I started thinking about how I could put together sort of a retirement role for myself to be a speaker, an advocate, talk about multiple pathways. And there are problems in the legal system around substance use, right? And so when I train the judges and lawyers, for example, one of the things I talk about is how a lot of times they are forcing people into the wrong treatment. For example, it's not uncommon for people to be forced into 12 steps for peer support instead of being given peer choice. And one of the things I tell them is that what you're doing is you are undermining the odds of success for the people for whom 12 steps isn't the best fit. But I also talk to them about, like, with drug court, are you setting realistic requirements, or are you setting people up for failure? Like the fact that most people don't have perfect abstinence from day one. I didn't have perfect abstinence. I used 3 times in my first 5 months. That to me, that was pretty good. If I would have used 3 times in 5 months on a regular basis, I wouldn't have been in rehab. So that was a lot better.
Mm-hmm.
But I talk to them about if they're making decisions around giving people around people's substance use, and if they're putting in requirements, whether it's for parole or probation or sentence reduction or drug court, are the requirements evidence-based, and are they realistic and practical, or are they setting people up for failure? So there's a lot of those kind of conversations I have with them.
Do you ever have people, colleagues or otherwise, sort of look down their nose at you when they find out about your story?
Well, I will say most of my former colleagues that have reached out to me, it's almost always a friends and family situation, that they're reaching out to me because they have a family member who is struggling with substances and they want to get advice and guidance. That's usually why I hear from people. I think if they're not happy with me, I probably just don't hear from them. But I will say I had my first big public announcement was in the Wall Street Journal. I had an opinion piece. They titled it, well, I beat addiction without God, but it was about how I recovered, outside the 12 steps. And in that piece, I said I was a former meth addict and a former judge. And I will say that people were not happy about that combination. Some people were not happy about it. They didn't think that it should have even been possible for me, to become a judge. And again, I was 20 years sober. Okay, I was 20 years sober. So I've definitely had pushback when I published opinion pieces, or when people read my book. Sometimes they send me messages about how God was really helping me. I just don't know it, or things like that. But sometimes people get upset with me because they don't think that someone who was shooting meth should be allowed, to professionally progress the way that I did.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Huh. So, you before the show today, you wanted to make sure that we talked about the correlation between trauma and addiction, and we may have already touched on it, but do you want to expand a little bit more on that, and how and some of the educations that you're offering around that now?
Yeah, I mean, one of the things I do talk about is that connection. So, a lot of people are familiar with the adverse childhood experiences scores. It's that list of 10 questions about things that happen in childhood. And if you have a score of 4 or more on the ACE test, your odds of developing a substance use disorder are about double than, the general population. And I scored 7 on that test. And so my odds were actually very high. And so it is a common connection between trauma, but it's also other mental health conditions, right? Another common pathway to developing an addiction is improperly treated or untreated mental health. So people often try to self-medicate, whether it's depression or anxiety or ADHD or whatever it might be. And so that's a big connection that part of the reason I talk about it is to try to get a little more empathy from America about addiction. We have it's such a mixed bag. It's like, on one hand, the government itself defines substance use disorder as a disease or a mental health disorder, and yet it's highly stigmatized, it's criminalized, which is a whole separate problem we could talk about.
Mm-hmm.
So I try to I think if people understand the core of it, that a lot of it's pain management. It's a improper or not long-term beneficial, but short-term beneficial pain management tool. That's why a lot of people start. It's why a lot of people get stuck there. I hope that maybe that'll increase people's understanding and empathy a little bit more.
Yeah. Got a comment from Barb.
Barb would like to know, can you come and talk to our government in Saskatchewan, please? They need to hear all this.
Yeah,
Facts.
I actually did. I went in Canada. I spoke at 2 fundraisers for a women's recovery organization in St. John in New Brunswick. So I know the government's a problem in America too. I mean, one of the things I talk about, and I had an op-ed in the LA Times about the racial disparity in drug enforcement laws, and I talk a lot about decriminalization. I think all drug use should be decriminalized. I think for multiple reasons. I think it's a contradiction to define it. The government, again, the disease or disorder, and then you're throwing people in jail for it. There's like 500,000 people in jail in America right now just for possession, not for any other drug-related crimes, just for possession. And another problem is that we don't have enough treatment. Sometimes people, again, in general, act like there's treatment on demand for substance use disorder, and there isn't. I mean, a very high percentage of people can't access treatment. And jail and prison is much more expensive than treatment, right? We could take those jail and prison incarceration dollars and help develop a more robust treatment system, a more robust also harm reduction system. But also there is a significant racial disparity in the way the drug laws are enforced. People of color who use drugs at basically the same rate as white people are much more likely to get arrested. The sentences are longer. The charges are more likely to be felonies than misdemeanors. And so there's a number of problems with the system that we have today in America. And I know Canada's a little better than we are, but I understand you guys have trouble too, including BC just is backtracking from decriminalization rules, just like Oregon did. So there's a lot of legal problems with drug criminalization.
Yeah. It's interesting that they're doing that so quickly. I feel like they didn't even give it a fair chance to work through the challenges, because
they didn't give it a fair chance.
No, and I think one of the big pushbacks that we're seeing in BC is because of how public use went up, like people just using in public and in public spaces and all of that,
parks and different things.
But I mean, I don't know that decrim is at the source of increased public use, because
it kind of was, because it was no longer illegal to use in public.
Yeah.
And I find it also interesting that this walking back of that decision was just at the outset of, summer, where you have tourism and different things of that nature. So for so long as there were no tourists and no economy potentially being impacted, it was okay. But if you have people using in parks and different things, that might scare the tourists away. So let's push everybody back into the back alleys and different things. I suspect that might be a big part of the decision.
Yeah.
But that's just me speculating.
Yeah.
Well, and I live near San Francisco, and I mean, a lot of the problem for public drug use is that we have a housing shortage. I mean, people aren't choosing to use drugs in the street. They live in the street. That's where they live. And so what do you expect to happen? And also in America, so far, there's only 2 overdose prevention sites, and those are in New York. We don't have them here in California. And so if you want people not to use on the street, well, then give them some place, and they are unhoused, then you need to give them a place that they can use that's not visible to other people. And there is an option for doing that. You just create a facility where you can allow that to happen. Yeah. But it's in Oregon too, they gave up too fast. The dollars really hadn't started to flow into the alternatives yet. It was a sort of a slow rollout process. And also Oregon got hit with fentanyl just at the same time that they were decriminalizing. And so a lot of the overdose death increase, people are blaming it on the decrim, but the truth is Washington State had a similar increase and they didn't decriminalize. It's just that Oregon and Washington got hit with fentanyl later than California and the East Coast. So it's not that it's not complicated, it is. But at the same time, if you're going to try the new solutions, let's give them a chance. We've been doing the war on drugs for over 50 years, and it's a failure. So why do we get 18 months to try the other options?
Yeah, no kidding. So you mentioned, and by the way, your story coming out, like usually people go and tell their story in a church basement or at a treatment center, and that was the first time that they told their story to the world. But no, you went to Wall Street. You had the Wall Street Journal, like. There's a saying in the program that goes, half measures avail us nothing. And Mary Beth is aligning with that one, I think.
That's true. I mean, I was out in my local community, but not, on the national stage like that. And once you announce in the Wall Street Journal that you shot meth, that's it.
Yeah, everyone knows.
You're back at that point. Yeah.
Yeah. Now we're practicing surrender.
Yes, but I will also say, so the title to my book is From Junkie to Judge, and I will say I wouldn't use the term junkie for someone else, but I chose it for a couple of reasons. One is because in a couple words it gets the whole arc, right?
Yeah.
But also I really feel like you said, meth is such a it's viewed as almost like people who shoot meth, it's hopeless for them. Like when you see shows on television where people are shooting meth, they're presented almost like animals in the zoo, like they're not human beings who deserve our empathy and our help. And so I really wanted to loudly own that I shot meth because I recovered, and to sort of use it as that reassurance that those people deserve our help too. There is definitely the possibility of recovery if they're given what they need to get there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you mentioned decrim, and you support decrim on all facets. Now, there is a marked difference between decriminalizing and legalizing. Where do you stand on the legalization of these substances?
I mean, I think, decriminalization for personal use is sort of the only possible sort of next step. But there's a lot of discussion now about safe supply, right? That if we provided drugs for people that aren't adulterated, like with fentanyl and, trank and all the other things they're going to invent and adulterate it with in the future, that it would be a way to reduce the overdose deaths. I mean, I know you guys have it bad in Canada, but in America, the last 3 years, we've had over 100,000 people a year die from overdose. And it's also hitting a lot of people who aren't long-term users. It used to be, in America at least, that almost everybody who died of an overdose had a long-term, addiction, usually an opiate addiction. But now that's still the largest group, but about 25% or more are people that are more casual users because of the fentanyls in the supply. They think they're taking an Oxy or a Percocet, and it's not, and they die behind closed doors. So the dynamics of it have changed a lot. So the safe supply idea is talking about, look, people are already addicted. Let's give them something that's, a measured dose. They know what's in it. It's like medication, and it has been done in Europe, and people either stay on it long term or some of them eventually get off. It's sort of a step in the transition. So I certainly would be in favor of setting up a system, that would work and be effective. Certainly, I think we should be looking at the option and seeing how we could, whether or not that would be feasible, under what would be the rules and what would be the parameters of that. It's not like they're going to give drugs away to people, to teenagers. It's going to be people who are already using on a regular basis. When they're talking about it, that's what they're really talking about, not free drugs for everybody.
Yeah. So like for me, like I don't align. I think that, sorry, I'm stuttering around here. I don't think that alcohol regulation is as tight as it should be. And I definitely don't think that the regulation of now illicit substances should align with our current regulation of alcohol. Can you align with that?
Well, I mean, I definitely, alcohol is the still the number one killer in the U.S., probably still in Canada, despite the overdose epidemic. So 140,000 people died of alcohol last year, and 120,000 in the U.S. died of overdose. And so it's still the number one killer. People underestimate, how bad alcohol is for you. And so, I mean, having good restrictions on alcohol is sort of an example system, right? It's a way that you do it. The other thing, I'm getting tired. I think I had another point and I forgot what it was. The other thing is sometimes we talk like people have trouble getting drugs. Like we do this, we're going to give them drugs that they couldn't otherwise get. Nobody has a problem finding drugs. I mean, let's be honest, people can get drugs. The drugs are already available. So
very available.
It's like with cannabis. Legalizing cannabis, what's going to happen? Your teenager can get cannabis now, like legal, illegal, it doesn't matter. So we need to stop pretending that we're living in a world that we're not living in and using that fantasy world to compare the solution against. Let's compare the solution against the real world and not the fantasy world.
Yeah.
Yeah, excellent point.
Anything else?
No, I don't. No.
Did we hit everything that you wanted to talk about tonight, Mary Beth?
I think so. I mean, just to drop my contact points, I'm on Twitter at Mary Beth _. And I will say, I don't argue with people on Twitter. I share the new studies that come out. I share articles. I share my recovery thoughts. My book, From Junkie to Judge, One Woman's Triumph Over Trauma and Addiction, which, by the way, is 30% about recovery. It's 30% is my first 3 years of recovery, building that individual plan. That's on Amazon and all the usual sites. And my website has my opinion pieces, junkietoJudge.com. And you can message me through my website if any questions or opportunities for me to speak. I answer all messages through my website.
Okay, we'll make sure those
Awesome.
links are in the show notes.
Mhm.
And thank you very much for joining us tonight, Mary Beth. It was a pleasure. A long time coming too. I'm glad that we were able to align. And I suppose that's it. Thank you very much. Take care.
Thanks for having me.
Okay, if you got anything out of that tonight, please hit that like button. Please drop us a comment. Every comment, every engagement matters. Please share with a friend. If you're not yet subscribed to Hard Knocks Talks on YouTube, please hit that subscribe button. Turn on notifications. We try to go live twice a week. We've got tons of content for you to catch up on. You can also find us on Apple Podcast, Spotify, wherever you listen to podcasts. That's all I got for you tonight. Thanks so much. Take care.
Say, this is Hard Knocks Talks.